And it's a pleasure to welcome you to the first of the two Oliver Smithies Lectures being given by Professor Stephen Brown. These lectures were generously sponsored by Professor Oliver Smithies, an Oxford graduate and distinguished scientist in the field of medical research. Smithies came to Oxford and to Balliol College from Yorkshire and received a BA in physiology in 1946. He went on to earn his master's degree and doctorate in biochemistry, also at Oxford. During the course of a career spanning more than half a century, Smithies has pioneered techniques that have advanced our understanding of ailments ranging from inflammation to cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, heart disease and high blood pressure. A pioneer leader of genetic research, he's received many awards internationally, including the Nobel Prize, and his work is particularly important in gene research in hypertension. Oliver Smithies instituted this lecture series to enable students and others from Oxford to hear and meet highly distinguished scientists and scholars from overseas. Speaking of his benefaction to this college, he remarked, "When I was a Balliol student, Linus Pauling made a visit to the college and greatly influenced my scientific career. I hope by establishing this fund at Balliol that future generations of undergraduates and graduates will have the opportunity to hear and meet outstanding academics from the USA working in a variety of fields, including scientific subjects." So we're very proud to be able to host that, and this is also being filmed today for Voices from Oxford. So our speaker today, now and again the next week on the 4th of March, is Professor Stephen Brown. He received his bachelor's and master's degree from St Bonaventure University and his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Louvain. He is Professor of Theology and Director of the Institute of Medieval Philosophy and Theology at Boston College. He has visiting professorship positions at Yale, the State University of New York at Buffalo, the University of Louvain, the Thomas Institute at Cologne, the École Pratique de Haute Étude at Revd University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. A festschrift in his honour, Philosophy and Theology in the Long Middle Ages, was published in 2011. His major publications have been the 5 volumes of the Opera Omnia of William of Ockham, where he has been the editor or the assistant editor with Gideon Gull. He's also published on Aquinas, on Bonaventure, of the relationship of medieval and classical philosophy, and edited in that territory too. Among the large collection of his scholarly articles, many have involved Latin text editions based on manuscripts here at Balliol. So we're very pleased to have you here with us for your talk today on moral virtue as a mean and as a means.
Good.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bruce. I'm very happy to be here and very pleased and honored that I was invited to give these lectures. The lectures, the Smithies Lectures, as he described why he wanted to set them up, was to have people here encounter those who have a certain kind of enthusiasm for their field and are able to turn you on by the enthusiasm that they have for the study that they do. I don't expect that my enthusiasm in my field is going to get you to become text editors, but I think the kind of detail that I can bring out from having done that kind of work and for the long years of teaching might at least give you some angles for what you will be doing yourself that might be very helpful. My field is really medieval philosophy. Sort of accidentally, I got into medieval theology because my wife was from Brooklyn and I was teaching in Tennessee, and the only way out was to go for a position in Boston where I'd have to switch fields. So I did that, and it's fairly easy to do when you're in the medieval field of philosophy because a lot of it is related to theology. I also have done a lot of editing work. And that has brought me since 1967 to Balliol to work on manuscripts that are here over in St. Cross, the former church there, where the manuscripts are preserved. And one of those is Codex 299, which is William of Ockham's work. But also, if you go to 199, 200, 201, those codices are also works of Robert Cowton, whom Occam fought against and quoted word for word exactly as the words are found in that manuscript. So there are a large number of works here that I have used in the past and even have used more recently. Some of the people even before Balliol, Richard Fishaker, Richard Rufus, they're writing in 1245, 1250. But it brings us back to what the university was like at that time, and to a certain degree that's what I'm going to be talking about, the structure of the university, why there's a university, and so on. So I'll take you back some way in my memory to the years just before Balliol and when the universities began, the beginning of the 13th century, the end of the 12th century, and why that happened. Before universities existed, there were schools. School you probably heard of, Thierry of Chartres or Lanfranc of Bec, Richard of St. Victor, you of St. Victor. Those are people whose names, at least if you have read any 12th or 13th century materials, you encounter. They're very strong individuals, have written works that are very influential through the rest of the Middle Ages. But the characteristic of a school is there is one master. And that one master is the one who runs everything and writes the works and delivers the lectures that are going to train a person. A university is not a collection of buildings. Universitas Magistrorum et Studentium. It's a community of masters and students. And it takes a community to fulfill the role that was majorly fulfilled by the first universities. And they had to fulfill the role basically of how do we deal with Aristotle. And the two lectures that I'll be giving are going to focus on Aristotle's background, particularly his ethics tonight, and next Wednesday his metaphysics. So those will be the two centers of focus. But I wanted to give some background that is more general so that you would appreciate the study of Aristotle and the influence that he had in the Middle Ages. There's always been a long Christian tradition in the Latin world as well as in the Greek world for study. You've heard of the fathers of the church. Everybody knows St. Augustine and Ambrose and Bede the Venerable and a great number of voices that have come through the ages. And there's a very, very strong tradition then of particularly what we call the Augustinian way of understanding the world. And the Augustinian way was very much influenced by philosophers, particularly Cicero and more particularly some of the Neoplatonic authors. He talks about the Platonists He also has studied other people that might be either considered Stoics, or they could be considered sort of Stoic Platonic or old Platonic students of philosophy. So the understanding as it existed through most of the Middle Ages is dependent upon this patristic kind of tradition. Aristotle is not known. He's not read except for his treatises that are purely logic treatises, method treatises. So Boetius, way back shortly after Augustine, he translated these logical works, and more particularly or specifically, he translated the categories and the Periharmonius, or the book on interpretations, how you interpret propositions, whether they're true or false. You don't have him doing translations, or at least they haven't survived in the translations of Aristotle's prior analytics or posterior analytics, or his treatise on probable proofs, or his sophistical refutations. Those works didn't survive if they were ever done by Boethius. But the first ones were there and were very influential. And they're influential because basically the education system, a very traditional one coming down from Greece and Rome, got you to prepare for any kind of superior studies by doing what are called the liberal arts, the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, and then the quadrivium, mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy. So those are basically the preparatory studies that you do. And when you study those, most particularly you study the great authors for those particular kinds of works. If you do grammar, you read Donatus and Priscian. And your teacher would be someone, your master would be someone who would become an expert and comment on those particular works. There might be all kinds of practical exercises that are more down to earth, but basically what you studied was a primary text in that particular field. If you wanted to do rhetoric, you studied certain works of Cicero. If you wanted to do music, you looked at Boethius' treatise on music. So there are all different kinds of special works that you studied, and that would prepare you then to go on to study something like law, canon law, church law, and you also might study theology. Usually you weren't studying medicine, but you could also go on to study medicine. These will develop much later when the universities are there. You'll also do your spade work, your preparatory work in the arts faculty, and then you will go on to study law, either church law or civil law, or you would go on to study theology, or you go on to study medicine. And those all had very specific texts, the same way as you had the texts for the liberal arts. So this was the general education that was there. In the 12th century, we're getting closer to Balliol's construction. In the 12th century, you start to get some of the works of Aristotle, his logic works, also being translated. So there'll be a distinction between the old logic, the categories and the Periharmonius, and the new logic, the prior analytics and the posterior analytics and the other works of Aristotle. No content work is translated. We don't know anything about Aristotle's treatises on what I'll talk about today, the ethics, the Nicomachean ethics, or his work that is metaphysics or physics, or the numberless treatises that he wrote on the history of animals and dreams and everything else. But those are not known until we get to the 13th century. And at first they come in translated from the Arabic. So Aristotle went from Greek to Syriac to Arabic to Latin. And if I sent you a letter in German that somebody translated into French and then into Hungarian and then into English. It might be far away from what I originally said. It's in the 13th century that you'll start to get going back to the Greek texts of Aristotle to get better translations. There's a kind of an iffiness about the texts until they become very definite. And keep in mind, you always focus on the basic texts. Donatus, Christian, Aristotle, if you're doing philosophy. So Aristotle's content philosophy starts to come in at the beginning of the 13th century. And you'll have at a place like Paris a certain kind of prohibition against formally reading, meaning going and having a lectio, a reading, a public reading done by an official master who's a reader. You have prohibitions against those being done until we can sift out whether Aristotle's content works, his substantial works, really are compatible with Christianity, can support Christianity, will undermine Christianity. How will we deal with it? That becomes Prohibition 1210, 1215, 1220s. By the 1240s, people start to say, oh, this is sort of on the books. But they have to bring to Paris Roger Bacon from Oxford. Paris is really considered a very much stronger university than Oxford at that time. But he was one of the people who was doing the kind of work that seemed to be needed. You'll find, for example, the Franciscans, almost no Franciscan author, famous author of the 13th century, got their degree mainly from Oxford. They might have studied here. They might have gone to different houses of Franciscans, but they got their degree from Paris. It's only in the beginning of the 14th century that Franciscans really become people who don't want to go to Paris. They want to stay in Oxford. They have their own kind of world that they're going to be dealing with. And that'll be true of other other religious orders as well. Things are changing, the institution's changing, and you start to see somebody like Roger Bacon arrive to explain some of the texts that as he understands them. And there's no great tradition for understanding them. So you're one of the first people to do that. And as the period goes on in Paris in the 1240s, it's not only do you have to do the 7 liberal arts, but the preparatory things start to take on logic that expands itself into the other works of Aristotle. So you have to at least have certain courses in Aristotle's Perihermeneus, maybe 2 lectures. That's all it might require. But by the 1245, you can't finish in the preparatory faculty unless you have done at least these minimal kinds of requirements in studying Aristotle. By the 1265s, the arts faculty, grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, etc., has become an Aristotelian philosophy faculty. Your preparation now for studying medicine, for studying law, for studying theology, is now Aristotle's works. An Aristotle that was ignored except for some of his logical organization and his use of categories and substance, quality, quantity, and things like that. Those were used, but the real substance works, like the Nicomachean Ethics and the physics and the metaphysics, those are the things that now start to be studied very, very carefully. If you were ever to sit down and look at the commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics of Thomas Aquinas, even if you look at the English edition now, it's about 400 pages. It's not like a decade or two before where you only had to take 2 lectures in a particular work. You're starting to do things in very, very serious ways. And that's why, along with the theological treatises I'll talk about on next Wednesday, there are all these philosophical treatises and commentaries. And they'll take on particular issues which will show the presence of Aristotle and his way of dealing with things. And then, to a very great extent, they're going to be compared to the way maybe Augustine might speak about the same things in De Civitate Dei. If you read the beginning of De Civitate Dei or Book 19, you will see there are very many passages there that if you put Aristotle up against them and compared them, there become real challenges that you have to deal with. And there are things that you can start to accept, and there are things that might present you with puzzles and difficulties. You can see some of these difficulties show up, particularly around the Condom Nations of 1277. There are 219 propositions that are condemned. And they're condemned really by a faculty committee made up of the theology faculty at the University of Paris at the instigation of the Bishop of Paris. And anybody who teaches these things cannot be allowed to continue teaching. Somebody like Giles of Rome, who's an Augustinian hermit and a student of Thomas Aquinas, he's prohibited from teaching because of some of his positions. But the chief thing that I think I would like to focus on is the philosophical faculty. The philosophical faculty, not the people who are having trouble with condemnations, but the attitude of mind of the liberal arts, or now Aristotelian philosophy faculty. Up till about 1270, no one wanted to stay in the arts faculty. In my kind of world, it would be like teaching freshman composition your whole life. I mean, who would want to do that? It would be equivalent to doing grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, and arithmetic, geometry, and just doing these basic kinds of things preparatory for the real things later on. So nobody got gray hair in the arts faculty until you get to the 1270s. And then all of a sudden, C.J. Brabant or Boetius of Dacia, these are big names because they're doing something that's really extraordinary. They decide they want to stay in the arts faculty. They want to do Aristotle's philosophy. If you look at Aristotle's posterior analytics, where he tells you what science is, science in the strictest sense of the term is going to deal with realities that are universal, necessary, unchanging, and it's going to be realities that you can establish their character through evidence. So if you don't have evidence, you don't really have science in the strict, really strong sense of the term of Aristotle's treatise on real demonstration and scientific knowledge. So what they decide, Boethius and C.J. Brabant, is they're going to stay. And they can deal with the kind of knowledge that is evident and the kind of knowledge that really meets the criteria of Aristotle's posterior analytics for science. What that is implicitly saying is when you deal with theology, you're dealing with things that you believe. And that might be good and noble, but it's not as strong as what you have in evidence. So it's sort of saying, I would prefer to do philosophy as an intellectual effort than to do theology, which is a faith effort. You can believe without doing that extra effort. You can still be a believer, but what you really want to pursue intellectually is going to be philosophy and Aristotle's philosophy, rather than going on to study passages of Scripture or interpretations of Augustine or citations from Gregory the Great or things like that. All of that is kind of built on faith an authority. It's not built on evidence. What you have, though, as you're in this faculty of philosophy now, you have people who are not going to say, well, the only place to do this is to stay and to only do philosophy. Once they start studying Aristotle very, very seriously, no matter what the works might be, they could go on to theology and carry those there. And that'll set up questions that you begin. Every theology treatise is going to start off with, is theology science or is it wisdom? What do you mean by science? Is it science in the sense of the posterior analytics? Is it wisdom in the sense of Augustine or wisdom in the sense of Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics? You get these kinds of debates about the nature of theology, and philosophy starts to play a much more strong a role in the development, at least, of certain aspects of theology. Theology can be the reading of Scripture, and the reading of Scripture can be of different kinds. If you go back like 100 and 150 years, Peter Cantor did a work called the Verbum Abbreviatum, and he talks about there being different ways in which you can study the Scriptures. You can study the Scriptures as something that is bringing peace to your soul. You can study the Scriptures as in some way directing you on how you should change your life and how you should live in a different way. You could also try to deal with heresies and get more precise in explaining things so that heresies can be dissipated and undermined. So you can do technical work that is intellectual and highly intellectual. That'll be the last of the kind of efforts that Peter Cantor will be indicating. But as you're doing that, you're really carrying out something that, if you know philosophy, you start doing these difficult doctrinal questions and dealing with heresies and dealing with all kinds of other intellectual problems related to Christian faith. You can deal with them in a very, very different, nuanced, philosophical way. You can learn a lot from Aristotle, and also you can be challenged by Aristotle to think of new ways of considering things. And that is essentially what is going to be going on at the end of the 13th and into the 14th century. One of the things that I would like to stress as this development of theology is going on, I'll probably say it again next Wednesday, is that usually when we focus, for whatever reasons, on anything medieval in theology, we focus on Thomas Aquinas. Some exceptions might be Duns Scotus or Bonaventure. When you see the way these people develop and write their commentaries on the ethics or on the metaphysics or write their theological works, when you see them doing this, there's nothing but admiration for what a university is. It really is a community of masters. We tend always to pick out the big names, and if I were trying to get one of my students a job, I have to have him doing articles on Thomas Aquinas. If they do an article on somebody like Peter O'Reilly, that you won't get a job anywhere. Or if you do it on somebody like Francis of Meironis, you have less of a chance. But Francis of Meironis and Peter O'Reilly are at a level of being a master, and so are all of these people, that every one of them really is worth studying. It's just that we live in a very practical kind of universe where it might not be the best thing to do your dissertation on one of these smaller known people because it's really not going to be very beneficial in terms of getting work. But they're worth reading. It's one of the reasons why I've spent most of my life doing 14th century authors, minor authors, because I just appreciate how great they are, how intelligent they are, how deep thinking they are. But to get to the main subject of Aristotle's ethics, what you find when you study the treatise of Aristotle, one of the main kinds of focus is on virtue. And what is virtue? The word is arete, which really is excellence. And it got the title virtue because for the Romans, when they translated arete, or excellence, into Latin, they picked what was the most important virtue, meaning courage, fighters, men fighting wars and things like this. They were the most important thing, so arete ended up becoming the chief kind of virtue that was dominant in Rome and got the name virtue. Now, what do you mean by virtue? Aristotle is going to say many of us can do good things, good acts, but essentially what he's trying to promote are acts that come forth from virtue. In other words, they come forth from habits. So I can be generous by accident. I could be walking down the street and somebody's begging and I give them just the money they need to really not be starving tonight. I could also be giving them money that's just going to make them go get a couple more bottles of beer or wine or something else and go on being drunk. But I could just accidentally, be generous. But when I build up a habit, it's repeated acts of generosity make it so that generosity is something that almost becomes second nature to me. And that's what he wants to do, is not just make you to do a good thing. He's trying to get you to change your typical way, your habitual way of acting. So if you want to become courageous, what you have to do is put yourself in situations that are a little bit more challenging, until after a while you can do them with ease. That's what a habitus is, or habit. That's what a virtue is. When I can be courageous. I have a line from Aristotle that can say, in some way, what is anger, what is courage, or what is generosity? He says, anyone can get angry. That's easy. Or you can give away money or spend it. But to do all this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, for the right reason, and in the right way is no longer something easy that anyone can do. It's for this reason that good conduct is rare, praiseworthy, and noble. And that's what a virtue is when you get to that stage that you can get angry at the right time, at the right person, to the right extent, know when to quit being angry, and all of these kinds of things. So this is what a virtue is. And there are two aspects of it that I wanted to stress from Aristotle. One is virtue is a means to get you to develop a more human way of living, a greater fulfillment of what is the potential in you. That's the whole way of Aristotle looking at things. We have a potential to become more human as the years go on, provided we practice the acts that are going to develop the virtues or habits for doing the things at the right time, to the right extent, and so on. That's the general direction of our life. It's presented to him or by him as something that is a potential that we have to actualize. You can and I can become more fully human, more fulfilled. My nature is made that way, and so is yours. That's the way he presents things. So that's what he's trying to develop, is to use virtues as a way of reaching your fulfillment, your human fulfillment, to be the best human being that you can possibly become. So virtue is a means to get to that end. Also, there's a way in which I'm sort of playing on words. Virtue is a mean. I'm playing on words that are Aristotle's words, though. A mean is hitting in between extremes, between some deficiency and some excess. And you might be more towards the excess, or you might be more towards the deficiency. You might be extremely timid, or you might be somebody who can get angry at everything. You're really very, very rash, and you're ready to explode at any time. And how do you get yourself to tone down and get to a mean, which for Aristotle is fundamentally something you can only discover you must have a natural capacity as you have a potentiality. You have a potentiality to really sense that there are people around you who seem to hit the mean much more often than anybody else. They're the people you want to look at. They're courageous enough when things are challenging, and yet they're not going to be over-explosive or too courageous or turning everything into a battle. They just have a kind of a sense, and they have a sense that they've developed. They've developed it because they've done repeated acts that allow them to get angry to the right extent, at the right time, for the right reason, and to know when to turn down and calm down. They just are that way. He stresses that very much, that you look for really examples of people doing this, because that's a much better way to learn. He has one phrase or paragraph that I'd like to read that stresses this very much. But most people do not perform good acts that will beget habits that are good, but they take refuge in theory and think they are being philosophers and will become good in this way, behaving somewhat like patients who listen attentively to their doctors, but do none of the things that they are ordered to do. As the latter will not be made well in body by such a course of treatment, the former will not be made well in soul by such a course of philosophy. It's not enough just to sit down and theorize about how can I really hit the happy mean between extremes so that I'm well balanced and courageous when I ought to be courageous, and I'm temperate when I ought to be temperate, and I'm just when I ought to be just. I won't get that way by reading philosophy books. I won't get that way by just discussing it with people. It's doing the acts. Those are the things that really make you temperate or just, or make you someone who's going to be truly courageous. Someone who just has a habit of doing the right thing at the right time, to the right extent, and so on. So these are the kinds of things that Aristotle will stress very much, or one of the things anyway, in the Nicomachean Ethics. He also might talk about intellectual virtues. One of those virtues is going to be prudence. So he has certain kinds of intellectual virtues or habits that we build up, where we deal with things that are unchanging, necessary, eternal kinds of objects or truths. They're very, very much worthwhile. It's what the posterior analytics focuses on. But they're also the practical, down-to-earth kinds of things that change and that you have to adapt as you live in society. I find it very challenging to live in our electronic society. It's moving so fast, and my grandkids can do these things quicker than me. You know, you have to learn how you can adapt to these things, at least to a reasonable degree. And that's what he means by prudence, and say, oh, this is going to change anyway in 5 years, so why should I learn how to type, or why should I learn this or that? You have to be able to make judgments that are prudent judgments about how much energy to invest in this or that, what's more important. That's what he tries to teach you. There's one final book of the Nicomachean Ethics, though, where I'll read you that passage of Aristotle, and it almost seems like this is the real meat for theologians. What is that which separates us from all the other animals is our reason. So he'll say, reason sort of elevates us so we can contemplate the eternal, necessary, unchanging realities. So if reason is divine, then in comparison with man, the life according to it is divine in comparison with human life. But we must not follow those who advise us, being men, to think of human things, and being mortal of mortal things, but must, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal. We have to do this insofar as we can. Make ourselves immortal and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing that is in us. For even if it be small in bulk, much more does it have in power and worth. It surpasses everything. And this would seem actually to be what each man is. The highest thing in him is his reason, since it is the authoritative and better part of him. What this is going to mean as you're writing commentaries on the Nicomachean Ethics, you can study the virtues, the intellectual and moral virtues, and what is a virtue, what is a mean, and all of these kinds of things. But one of the great lessons that anybody who's reading the scriptures can focus on is it's telling us we ought to pursue the most spiritual things, the highest things. We ought to become divine and live according to the divine potential that is in us. What you'll find is that's very easy then to adapt to the scriptures, where you might be talking about the heavenly life and contemplating God, and that's the ultimate end of man. That's what we're aiming for. You'll find if you read Thomas Aquinas' commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics that he'll talk a great deal. I told you about 400 pages. He'll take a great deal about the moral virtues and how to hit the mean and how to be prudent and everything else, but he also gets to Book 10, and there he starts to talk about the afterlife and contemplation, and that's really the highest kind of thing we should be aiming for as men. But he makes a distinction. He talks about perfect happiness and imperfect happiness. It's sort of a kind of set of categories that you don't find in Augustine and the earlier kind of Christian tradition. The accent in Augustine is very much on the afterlife and union with God and so on. It's not that he's against things in this world. He'll even advise somebody who wants to live in the desert that it'd be better if you joined the army. The city of Rome needs defenders. So he can at times be down to earth. But the distinction between the search for perfect and imperfect happiness, and the distinctions that Aquinas are bringing in, are very much accentuating that man should be pursuing happiness in this life. It's not the ultimate happiness, but it is something to be really serious about, and Aristotle's moral and intellectual virtues help you to be serious about it. But man has also a greater goal that's pointed out mainly in the scriptures, but also is hinted at in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics. You would think that would be the whole story. If you go to Albert the Great, who's a little bit before Aquinas, and Aquinas really studied the ethics under Albert the Great when he was doing his ethics, you'll find that Albert the Great doesn't spend any time on Book 10. He spends his time on the down-to-earth human happiness that would be described as pursuing imperfect happiness. And not only is that true of Albert the Great, it's also true of many of the commentaries on the ethics. Most of them do not get into using Aristotle's ethics as really a way of promoting, the scriptural portrayal of any kind of an afterlife and union with God and the beatific vision. They very much, at least within the context of their writing commentaries on Aristotle, they accentuate the earlier books of Aristotle rather than Book 10 and the need for contemplation and speculative ways of seeing things. Those are not going to be the ones that are primarily pushed by commentators on the Nicomachean ethics. What I'm trying to bring out is these people just don't memorize Aristotle. They really bring him into all of the discussion. They'll interpret him in different ways. They'll appreciate him at different levels and for different reasons. So there's very much of a deeper kind of understanding that they're attempting to achieve. It's not just that they're using this to confirm things they already believe. They really are learning philosophy. So instead of C.J. of Brabant or Boetius of Dacia winning the day and having theology abandoned by people, they're going to really raise up the philosophical level of discussion within theology and make the kind of distinctions that Aquinas makes between perfect and imperfect happiness, and the many other distinctions that are going to try to bring some kind of real philosophical depth and foundation with the help of Aristotle and other people along the way. I'll talk about those next week, because when Aristotle's works come in, it would be worthwhile if you could find somebody who's read them ahead of you. And that's particularly going to be the Arabs. Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi and Avicenna are going to be reading the metaphysics, and that's what I'll be dealing with next week, is the way that they are in a fashion giving some preparation of people who have some kind of scriptures that they accept, and they're trying to use philosophy in relation to that. They'll do it in different fashions, but they'll also present options then when you find Christians in the Latin West getting Aristotle. They start to also say, well, let's go back to people like Avicenna or people like Al-Kindi. They might be able to help us to deal with our problems in theology. So that's what I'll talk about next Wednesday, but I wanted to accentuate today the differential, or the differences that you see in the commentaries, and the rich differences that you see in the commentaries on the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle. Okay, thank you.